Part 3, Section 6 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy, Section 44. She came to them often after that, sometimes alone, twice with Johnny Dromore, sometimes with young Oliver, who, under Sylvia's spell, soon lost his standoff air. And the statuette was begun. Then came spring in earnest, and that real business of life, the racing of horses on the flat, when Johnny Dromore's genius was no longer hampered by the illegitimate risks of jumpin'. He came to dine with them the day before the first Newmarket meeting. He had a soft spot for Sylvia, always saying to Lennon as he went away, "Charmin' woman, your wife." She too had a soft spot for him, having fathomed the utter helplessness of this worldling's wisdom, and thinking him pathetic. After he was gone that evening, she said, "Ought we to have Nels to stay with us while you're finishing her? She must be very lonely now that her father's so far away." It was like Sylvia to think of that. But would it be pleasure or vexation to have in the house this child with her quaint grown-upness, her confiding ways, and those perdita eyes? In truth, he did not know. She came to them with touching alacrity, very like a dog who, left at home when the family goes for a holiday, takes at once to those who make much of it. And she was no trouble, too well accustomed to amuse herself, and always quaint to watch, with their continual changes from child to woman of the world. A new sensation, this of a young creature in the house. Both he and Sylvia had wanted children, without luck. Twice illness had stood in the way. Was it perhaps just that a little lack in her, that lack of poignancy, which had prevented her from becoming a mother? An only child herself, she had no nieces or nephews. Cicely's boys had always been at school, and now were out in the world. Yes, a new sensation, and one in which Lennon's restless feelings seemed to merge and vanish. Outside the hours when Nell sat to him, he purposely saw but little of her, leaving her to nestle under Sylvia's wing. And this she did, as if she never wanted to come out. Thus he preserved his amusement at her quaint warmth and quainter calmness, her aesthetic pleasure in watching her, whose strange half-hypnotized, half-hypnotic gaze had a sort of dreamy and pathetic lovingness, as if she were brimming full of affections that had no outlet. Every morning after sitting, she would stay an hour bent over her own drawing, which made practically no progress, and he would often catch her following his movements with those great eyes of hers, while the sheep-dogs would lie perfectly still at her feet, blinking horribly. Such was her attraction. His birds also, a jackdaw and an owl, who had the run of the studio, tolerated her as they tolerated no other female, save the housekeeper. The jackdaw would perch on her and peck her dress, but the owl merely engaged her in comments of mesmeric gazing, which never ended in victory for either. Now that she was with them, Oliver Dromer began to haunt the house, coming at all hours on very transparent excuses. She behaved to him with extreme capriciousness, sometimes hardly speaking, sometimes treating him like a brother. And in spite of all his nonchalance, the poor youth would just sit glowering or gazing out his adoration, according to her mood. One of these July evenings Lennon remembered beyond all others. He had come after a hard day's work, out from his studio into the courtyard garden, to smoke a cigarette and feel the sun on his cheek before it sank behind the wall. A piano organ far away was grinding out a waltz, and on a hydrangea tub under the drawing-room window he sat down to listen. Nothing was visible from there, save just the square patch of a quite blue sky, and one soft plume of smoke from his own kitchen chimney. Nothing audible save that tune and the never-ending street murmur. Twice birds flew across, starlings. It was very peaceful, and his thoughts went floating like the smoke of his cigarette, to meet who knew what other thoughts, for thoughts, no doubt, had little swift lives of their own, desired, found their mates, and lightly blending, set forth offspring. Why not? All things are possible in this wonder house of a world. Even that waltz tune, floating away, would find some melody to wed, and twine with, and produce a fresh chord that might float in turn to catch the hum of a gnat or fly, and breed again. Queer how everything sought to entwine with something else. On one of the pinkish blooms of a hydrangea he noted a bee. Of all things in this hidden away garden of tiles and gravel, and plants in tubs. The little furry, lonely thing was drowsily clinging there, as if it had forgotten what it had come for, seduced maybe, like himself, from labor by these last rays of the sun. Its wings, close furled, were glistening, its eyes seemed closed, and the piano organ played on, a tune of yearning, wanting, yearning. Then, through the window above his head, he heard Oliver Dromer, a voice one could always tell, pitched high with its slight drawl, pleading, very softly at first, then insistent, imperious, and suddenly Nell's answering voice. "I won't, Oliver, I won't, I won't." He rose to go out of earshot. Then a door slammed, and he saw her at the window above him, her waist on a level with his head, flushed with her gray eyes ominously bright, her full lips parted, and he said, "What is it, Nell?" She leaned down and caught his hand. Her touch was fiery hot. "He kissed me. I won't let him. I won't kiss him." Through his head went a medley of sayings to soothe children that it hurt, but he felt unsteady, unlike himself, and suddenly she knelt and put her hot forehead against his lips. It was as if she had really been a little child, wanting the place kiss to make it well. End of section 44. Part 3, Section 7 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy, Section 45. After that strange outburst, Lennon considered long whether he should speak to Oliver. But what could he say, from what standpoint say it, and with what feeling? Or should he speak to Dromore? Not very easy to speak on such a subject to one of whose turf all spiritual matters were so permanently warned. Nor somehow could he bring himself to tell Sylvia. It would be like violating a confidence to speak of the child's outburst in that quivering moment when she had kneeled and put her hot forehead to his lips for comfort. Such a disclosure was for Nell herself to make, if she so wished. And then young Oliver solved the difficulty by coming to the studio himself the next day. He entered with Dromore composure, very well groomed, in a silk hat, a cutaway black coat, and charming lemon-colored gloves. What indeed the youth did, besides belonging to the yeomanry and hunting all winter, seemed only known to himself. He made no excuse for interrupting Lennon, and for some time sat silently smoking his cigarette, and pulling the ears of the dogs. And Lennon worked on, waiting. There was always something attractive to him in this young man's broad, good-looking face, with its crisp dark hair and half-insolent good humor, now so clouded. At last Oliver got up and went over to the unfinished Girl on the Magpie Horse. Turning to it so that his face could not be seen, he said, "You and Mrs. Lennon have been awfully kind to me. I behaved rather like a cad yesterday. I thought I'd better tell you. I want to marry Nell, you know." Lennon was glad that the young man's face was so religiously averted. He let his hands come to anchor on what he was working at before he answered, "She's only a child, Oliver." And then, watching his fingers making an inept movement with the clay, was astonished at himself. "She'll be 18 this month," he heard Oliver say. "If she once gets out amongst people I don't know what I shall do. Old Johnny's no good to look after her." The young man's face was very red. He was forgetting to hide it now. Then it went white, and he said through clenched teeth, "She sends me mad. I don't know what not to. If I don't get her, I shall shoot myself. I shall, you know, I'm that sort. It's her eyes. They draw you right out of yourself and leave you." And from his gloved hand, the smoked-out cigarette end fell to the floor. "They say her mother was like that. Poor old Johnny. Do you think I've got a chance, Mr. Lennon? I don't mean now, this minute. I know she's too young." Lennon forced himself to answer. I dare say, my dear fellow, I dare say, have you talked with my wife? Oliver shook his head. She's so good, I don't think she'd quite understand my sort of feeling. A queer little smile came up on Lennon's lips. Ah, well, he said, you must give the child time, perhaps when she comes back from Ireland after the summer. The young man answered moodily, Yes, I've got the run of that, you know, and I shan't be able to keep away. He took up his hat. I suppose I oughtn't to have come and bored you about this, but Nell thinks such a lot of you, and you being different to most people, I thought you wouldn't mind. He turned again at the door. It wasn't gas, what I said just now about not getting her. Fellows say that sort of thing, but I mean it. He put on that shining hat and went. And Lennon stood, staring at the statuette. So, passion broke down even the defenses of dromordom. Passion. Strange hearts it chose to bloom in. Being different to most people, I thought you wouldn't mind. How had this youth known that Sylvia would not understand passion so out of hand as this? And what had made it clear that he would? Was there, then, something in his face? There must be. Even Johnny Dromore, most reticent of creatures, had confided to him that 1 hour of his astute existence, when the wind had swept him out to sea. Yes, and that statuette would never be any good, try as he might. Oliver was right. It was her eyes. How they had smoked in their childish anger. If eyes could be said to smoke, and how they had drawn and pleaded when she put her face to his in her still more childish entreaty. If they were like this now, what would they be when the woman in her woke? Just as well not to think of her too much. Just as well to work. And take heed that he would soon be 47. Just as well that next week she would be gone to Ireland. And that last evening, before she went, they took her to see Carmen at the opera. He remembered that she wore a nearly high white frock and a dark carnation in the ribbon tying her crinkly hair that still hung loose. How wonderfully entranced she sat, drunk on that opera that he had seen a score of times, now touching his arm, now Sylvia's, whispering questions. Who's that? What's coming now? The Carmen roused her to adoration, but Don Jose was too fat in his funny little coat, till, in the maddened jealousy of that last act, he rose superior. Then, quite lost in excitement, she clutched Lennon's arm, and her gasp, when Carmen at last fell dead, made all their neighbors jump. Her emotion was far more moving than that on the stage. He wanted badly to stroke and comfort her and say, There, there, my dear, it's only make-believe. And when it was over, and the excellent murdered lady and her poor fat little lover appeared before the curtain, finally forgetting that she was a woman of the world, she started forward in her seat and clapped. And clapped. Fortunate that Johnny Dromer was not there to see. But all things coming to an end, they had to get up and go. And as they made their way out to the hall, Lennon felt a hot little finger crooked into his own, as she simply must have something to squeeze. He really did not know what to do with it. She seemed to feel this half-heartedness, soon letting it go. All the way home in the cab she was silent. With that same abstraction she ate her sandwiches and drank her lemonade, took Sylvia's kiss, and quite a woman of the world once more, begged that they would not get up to see her off, for she was to go at 7 in the morning to catch the Irish mail. Then, holding out her hand to Lennon, she very gravely said, Thanks most awfully for taking me tonight. Goodbye. He stayed for a full half an hour at the window, smoking. No street lamp shone just there, and the night was velvety black above the plane trees. At last, with a sigh, he shut up, and went tiptoeing upstairs in darkness. Suddenly in the corridor, the white wall seemed to move at him. A warmth, a fragrance, a sound like a tiny sigh, and something soft was squeezed into his hand. Then the wall moved back, and he stood listening. No sound, no anything. But in his dressing room he looked at the soft thing in his hand. It was the carnation from her hair. What had possessed the child to give him that? Carmen. Ah, Carmen. And gazing at the flower, he held it away from him with a sort of terror. But its scent arose, and suddenly he thrust it, all fresh as it was, into a candle flame, and held it burning, writhing till it blackened to velvet. Then his heart smote him for so cruel a deed. It was still beautiful, but its scent was gone, and turning to the window, he flung it far out into the darkness. End of section 45. Part 3, Section 7 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy, Section 46. Now that she was gone, it was curious how little they spoke of her, considering how long she had been with them. And they had from her but one letter written to Sylvia, very soon after she left, ending, "Dad sends his best respects. Please, and with my love to you and Mr. Lennon and all the beasts, Nell. Oliver is coming here next week. We are going to some races." It was difficult, of course, to speak of her, with that episode of The Flower too bizarre to be told. The sort of thing Sylvia would see out of all proportion, as indeed any woman might. Yet, what had it really been but the uncontrolled impulse of an emotional child longing to express feelings kindled by the excitement of that opera? What but a child's feathery warmth, one of those flying peeps at the mystery of passion that young things take? He could not give away that pretty foolishness, and because he would not give it away, he was more than usually affectionate to Sylvia. They had made no holiday plans, and he eagerly fell in with her suggestion that they should go down to Hale. There, if anywhere, this curious restlessness would leave him. They had not been down to the old place for many years. Indeed, since Gordy's death, it was generally let. They left London late in August. The day was closing in when they arrived. Honeysuckle had long been improved away from that station paling against which he had stood 29 years ago, watching the train carrying Anna Stormer away. In the hired fly, Sylvia pressed close to him and held his hand beneath the ancient dust rag. Both felt the same excitement at seeing this old home. Not a single soul of the past days would be there now, only the house and the trees, the owls and the stars, the river, park, and Loganstone. It was dark when they arrived. Just their bedroom and 2 sitting rooms had been made ready, with fires burning, though it was still high summer. The same old execrable heather leaves looked down from the black oak panelings. The same scent of apples and old mice clung here and there about the dark corridors, with their unexpected stairways. It was all curiously unchanged, as old the houses are when they are lit furnished. Once in the night he woke. Through the wide-open, uncurtained windows the night was simply alive with stars, such swarms of them swinging and trembling up there, and far away rose the melancholy velvet soft hooting of an owl. Sylvia's voice, close to him, said, "Mark, the night when your star caught in my hair, do you remember?" Yes, he remembered, and in his drowsy mind, just roused from dreams, there turned and turned the queer nonsensical refrain, "I never, never will desert Mr. Micawber." A pleasant month that, of reading and walking with the dogs the country round, of lying out long hours amongst the boulders or along the river banks, watching beasts and birds. The little old greenhouse, temple of his early masterpieces, was still extant, used now to protect watering pots, but no vestige of impulse towards work came to him down there. He was marking time, not restless, not bored, just waiting, but for what, he had no notion. And Sylvia, at any rate, was happy, blooming in these old haunts, losing her fairness in the sun, even taking again to a sunbonnet, which made her look extraordinarily young. The trout that poor old Gordy had so harried were left undisturbed. No gun was fired. Rabbits, pigeons, even the few partridges, enjoyed those first days of autumn unmolested. The bracken and leaves turned very early, so that the park in the hazy September sunlight had an almost golden hue. A gentle mellowness reigned over all that holiday, and from Ireland came no further news, save one picture postcards with the words, "This is our house, Nell." In the last week of September they went back to London. and at once there began in him again that restless, unreasonable aching, that sense of being drawn away out of himself, so that he once more took to walking the park for hours, over grass already strewn with leaves, always looking, craving, and for what? At Dromore's the confidential man did not know when his master would be back. He had gone to Scotland with Miss Nell after the St. Leger. Was Lennon disappointed? Not so. Relieved, rather. But his ache was there all the time, feeding on its secrecy and loneliness, unmentionable feeling that it was. Why had he not realized long ago that youth was over, passion done with him, autumn upon him? How never grasp the fact that time steals away, and as before, the only refuge was in his work. The sheepdogs and the girl on the magpie horse were finished. He began a fantastic relief, a nymph peering from behind a rock and a wild-eyed man creeping through reeds towards her. If he could put into the nymph's face something of his lure of youth and life and love that was dragging at him, into the man's face the state of his own heart, it would lay that feeling to rest. Anything to get it out of himself. And he worked furiously, laboriously, all October, making no great progress. What could he expect when life was all the time knocking with that muffled tapping at his door? It was on Tuesday, after the close of the last Newmarket meeting, and just getting dusk, when life opened the door and walked in. She wore a dark red dress, a new one, and surely her face, her figure, were very different from what he had remembered. They had quickened and become poignant. She was no longer a child that was at once plain. Cheeks, mouth, neck, waist, all seemed fine, shaped. The crinkly light brown hair was coiled up now under a velvet cap. Only the great grey eyes seemed quite the same. And at sight of her, his heart gave a sort of dive and flight, as if all its vague and wistful sensations had found their goal. Then, in sudden agitation, he realized that his last moment with this girl, now a child no longer, had been a secret moment of warmth and of emotion, a moment which to her might have meant, in her might have bred, feelings that he had no inkling of. He tried to ignore that flighting and diving of his heart, held out his hand, and murmured, "Ah, Nell, back at last, you've grown." Then, with a sensation of every limb gone weak, he felt her arms around his neck, and herself pressed against him. There was time for the thought to have flashed through him. This is terrible. He gave her a little convulsive squeeze. Could a man do less? Then just managed to push her gently away, trying with all his might to think, she's a child. It's nothing more than after Carmen. She doesn't know what I am feeling. But he was conscious of a mad desire to clutch her to him. The touch of her had demolished all his vagueness, made things only too plain, set him on fire. He said uncertainly, "Come to the fire, my child, and tell me about it." If he did not keep to the notion that she was just a child, his head would go, Perdita, the lost one. A good name for her indeed, as she stood there, her eyes shining in the firelight, more mesmeric than ever they had been. And to get away from the lure of those eyes, he bent down and raked the grate, saying, "Have you seen Sylvia?" But he knew that she had not, even before she gave her that impatient shrug. Then he pulled himself together and said, "What has happened to you, child?" "I'm not a child." "No, we've both grown older. I was 47 the other day." She caught his hand. Heavens, how supple she was, and murmured, "You're not old a bit. You're quite young." At his wit's end, with his heart thumping, but still keeping his eyes away from her, he said, "Where is Oliver?" She dropped his hand at that. "Oliver, I hate him." Afraid to trust himself near her, he had begun walking up and down, and she stood, following him with her gaze. The firelight playing on her red frock. What extraordinary stillness, what power she had developed in those few months. Had he let her see that he felt that power? And had all this come of one little moment in a dark corridor, of one flower pressed into his hand? Why had he not spoken to her roughly then, told her she was a romantic little fool? God knew what thoughts she had been feeding on, but who could have supposed, who dreamed? And again he fixed his mind resolutely on the thought, She's only a child. Only a child. Come, he said. Tell me all about your time in Ireland. Oh, it was just dull. It's all been dull away from you. It came out without hesitancy or shame, and he could only murmur, "Ah, you've missed your drawing?" "Yes. Can I come tomorrow?" That was the moment to have said, "No, you are a foolish child, and I an elderly idiot." But he had neither courage nor clearness of mind enough, nor the desire. And without answering, he went towards the door to turn up the light. "Oh no, please don't. It's so nice like this." The shadowy room, the bluish dusk painted on all the windows, the fitful shining of the fire, the pallor and the darkness of the dim casts and bronzes, and that one glowing figure there before the earth. And her voice, a little piteous, went on, "Aren't you glad I'm back? I can't see you properly out there." He went back into the glow, and she gave a little sigh of satisfaction. Then her calm young voice said ever so distinctly, "Oliver wants me to marry him, and I won't, of course." He dared not say, "Why not?" He dared not say anything. It was too dangerous. And then followed those amazing words, "You know why, don't you? Of course you do." It was ridiculous, almost shameful to understand their meaning. And he stood, staring in front of him, without a word, humility, dismay, pride, and a sort of mad exultation, all mixed and seething within him, in the queerest puddling of emotion. But all he said was, "Come, my child, we are neither of us quite ourselves tonight. Let's go to the drawing room." End of section 46.
Part 9, Section 47 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Carolyn Spencer-Kerridge. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. Section 47. Back in the darkness and solitude of the studio, when she was gone, he sat down before the fire, his senses in a whirl. Why was he not just an ordinary animal of a man that could enjoy what the gods had sent? It was as if on a November day someone had pulled aside the sober curtains of the sky, and there in a chink had been April standing. Thick, white blossom, a purple cloud, a rainbow, grass vivid green, light flaring from one knew not where, and such a tingling passion of life on it all as made the heart stand still. This, then, was the marvellous, enchanting, maddening end of all that year of restlessness and wanting, this bit of spring suddenly given to him in the midst of autumn. Her lips, her eyes, her hair, her touching confidence. Above all, quite unbelievable, her love. Not really love, perhaps, just childish fancy. But on the wings of fancy, this child would fly far, too far, all wistfulness and warmth beneath the light veneer of absurd composure. To live again, to plunge back into youth and beauty, to feel spring once more, to lose the sense of all being over, save just the sober jog-trot of domestic bliss. To know, actually to know, ecstasy again in the love of a girl, to rediscover all that youth yearns for, and feels, and hopes, and dreads, and loves. It was a prospect to turn the head even of a decent man. By just closing his eyes he could see her standing there with the firelight glow on her red frock, could feel again that marvellous thrill when she pressed herself against him in the half-innocent, seducing moment when she first came in, could feel again her eyes drawing him. She was a witch, a grey-eyed, brown-haired witch, even unto her love of red. She had the witch's power of lighting fever in the veins. And he simply wondered at himself that he had not, as she stood there in the firelight, knelt and put his arms round her and pressed his face against her waist. Why had he not? But he did not want to think. The moment thought began, he knew he must be torn this way and that, tossed here and there between reason and desire, pity and passion. Every sense struggled to keep him wrapped in the warmth and intoxication of this discovery that he, in the full of autumn, had awakened love in spring. It was amazing that she could have this feeling, yet there was no mistake. Her manner to Sylvia just now had been almost dangerously changed. There had been a queer, cold impatience in her look, frightening from one who but 3 months ago had been so affectionate. And going away, she had whispered, with that old trembling up at him, as if offering to be kissed. I may come, mayn't I? And don't be angry with me, please. I can't help it. A monstrous thing at his age to let a young girl love him, compromise her future. A monstrous thing by all the canons of virtue and gentility. And yet, what future? With that nature, those eyes, that origin, with that father and that home. But he would not, simply must not think. Nevertheless, he showed the signs of thought, and badly, for after dinner, Sylvia, putting her head on his forehead, said, You're working too hard, Mark. You don't go out enough. He held those fingers fast. Sylvia. No, indeed, he must not think. But he took advantage of her words, and said that he would go out and get some air. He walked at a great pace, to keep thought away, till he reached the river close to Westminster, and, moved by sudden impulse, seeking perhaps an antidote, turned down into that little street under the big Wren church, where he had never been since the summer night when he lost what was then more to him than life. There she had lived. There was the house, those windows which he had stolen past and gazed at with such distress and longing. Who lived there now? Once more he seemed to see that face out of the past, the dark hair, and dark soft eyes, and sweet gravity, and it did not reproach him, for this new feeling was not a love like that had been. Only once could a man feel the love that passed all things, the love before which the world was but a spark in a draught of wind, the love that whatever dishonour, grief, and unrest it might come through, alone had in it the heart of peace and joy and honour. Fate had torn that love from him, nipped it off as a sharp wind nips off a perfect flower. This new feeling was but a fever, a passionate fancy, a grasping once more at youth and warmth. Ah, well, but it was real enough. And in one of those moments when a man stands outside himself, seems to be lifted away and see his own life twirling, Lennon had a vision of a shadow driven here and there, a straw going round and round, a midge in the grip of a mad wind. Where was the home of this mighty secret feeling that sprang so suddenly out of the dark and caught you by the throat? Why did it come now and not then, for this one and not that other? What did man know of it, save that it made him spin and hover, like a moth intoxicated by a light, or a bee by some dark sweet flower? Save that it made of him a distraught, humble, eager puppet of its fancy? Had it not once already driven him even to the edge of death? And must it now come on him again with its sweet madness, its drugging scent? What was it? Why was it? Why these passionate obsessions that could not decently be satisfied? Had civilization so outstripped man that his nature was cramped into shoes too small, like the feet of a Chinese woman? What was it? Why was it? And faster than ever he walked away. Pall Mall brought him back to that counterfeit presentment of the real reality. There in St. James's Street was Johnny Dromore's club, and again, moved by impulse, he pushed open its swing door. No need to ask, for there was Dromore in the hall, on his way from dinner to the card room. The glossy tan of hard exercise and good living lay on his cheeks as thick as clotted cream. His eyes had the peculiar shine of superabundant vigour. A certain sub-festive air in face and voice and movements suggested that he was going to make a night of it. And the sardonic thought flashed through Lennon, shall I tell him? Hello, old chap. Awfully glad to see you. What you doing with yourself? Working hard? How's your wife? You been away? Been doing anything great? And then the question that would have given him his chance, if he had liked to be so cruel. Seen Nell? Yes, she came round this afternoon. What do you think of her? Coming on nicely, isn't she? That old query, half furtive and half proud, as much as to say, I know she's not in the stud book, but I sired her. And then the old sudden gloom, which lasted but a second, and gave way again to chaff. Lennon stayed very few minutes. Never had he felt farther from his old school chum. No, whatever happened, Johnny Dromore must be left out. It was a position he had earned with his goggling eyes and his astute philosophy. From it he should not be disturbed. He passed along the railings of the Green Park. On the cold air of this last October night, a thin haze hung, and the acrid fragrance from little bonfires of fallen leaves. What was there about that scent of burned leaf smoke that had always moved him so? Symbol of parting, that most mournful thing in all the world. For what would even death be but for parting? Sweet, long sleep, or new adventure. But if a man loved others, to leave them or be left. Ah! And it was not death only that brought partings. He came to the opening of the street where Dromore lived. She would be there, sitting by the fire in the big chair, playing with her kitten, thinking, dreaming, and alone. He passed on at such a pace that people stared, till turning the last corner for home, he ran almost into the arms of Oliver Dromore. The young man was walking with unaccustomed indecision, his fur coat open, his opera hat pushed up on his crisp hair. Dark under the eyes, he had not the proper gloss of a Dromore at this season of the year. "Mr. Lennon, I've just been round to you." And Lennon answered dazedly, "Will you come in, or shall I walk your way a bit?" "I'd rather out here, if you don't mind." So in silence they went back into the square, and Oliver said, "Let's get over by the rails." They crossed to the railings of the square's dark garden, where nobody was passing, and with every step Lennon's humiliation grew. There was something false and undignified in walking with this young man who had once treated him as a father confessor to his love for Nell, and suddenly he perceived that they had made a complete circuit of the square garden without speaking a single word. "Yes?" he said. Oliver turned his face away. "You remember what I told you in the summer? Well, it's worse now. I've been going a mucker lately in all sorts of ways to try and get rid of it. But it's all no good. She's got me." And Lennon thought, "You're not alone in that." But he kept silence. His chief dread was of saying something that he would remember afterwards as the words of Judas. Then Oliver suddenly burst out, "Why can't she care? I suppose I'm nothing much, but she has known me all her life, and she used to like me. There's something I can't make out. Could you do anything for me with her?" Lennon pointed across the street. "In every other one of those houses, Oliver," he said, "there's probably some creature who can't make out why another creature doesn't care. Passion comes when it will, goes when it will, and we poor devils have no say in it. What do you advise me, then?" Lennon had an almost overwhelming impulse to turn on his heel and leave the young man standing there, but he forced himself to look at his face, which even then had its attraction, perhaps more so than ever, so pallid and desperate it was, and he said slowly, staring mentally at every word, "I'm not up to giving you advice. The only thing I might say is, one does not press oneself where one isn't wanted. All the same, who knows? So long as she feels you're there, waiting, she might turn to you at any moment. The more chivalrous you are, Oliver, the more patiently you wait, the better chance you have." Oliver took those words of little comfort without flinching. "I see," he said. "Thanks. But my God, it's hard. I never could wait." And with that epigram on himself, holding out his hand, he turned away. Lennon went slowly home, trying to gauge exactly how anyone who knew all would judge him. It was a little difficult in this affair to keep a shred of dignity. Sylvia had not gone up, and he saw her looking at him anxiously. The one strange comfort in all this was that his feeling for her, at any rate, had not changed. It seemed even to have deepened, to be more real to him. How could he help staying awake that night? How could he help thinking, then? And long time he lay staring at the dark, as if thinking were any good for fever in the veins. End of section 47. Recording by Carolyn, Spencer-Kerridge.
Part 3, Section 10 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy, Section 48. Passion never plays the game. It, at all events, is free from self-consciousness and pride, from dignity, nerves, scruples, cant, moralities, from hypocrisies and wisdom and fears for pocket and position in this world and the next. Well did the old painters limn it as an arrow or a wind. If it had not been as swift and darting, earth must long ago have drifted through space unattainted to let. After that fevered night, Lennon went to his studio at the usual hour and naturally did not do a stroke of work. He was even obligated to send away his model. The fellow had been his hairdresser, but getting ill and falling on dark days, one morning had come to the studio to ask with manifest shame if his head were any good. After having tested his capacity for standing still and giving him some introductions, Lennon had noted him down. 5'9", good hair, lean face, something tortured and pathetic. Give him a turn if possible. The turn had come, and the poor man was posing in a painful attitude, talking whenever permitted of the way things had treated him, and the delights of cutting hair. This morning he took his departure with the simple pleasure of one fully paid for services not rendered. And so, walking up and down, the sculptor waited for Nell's knock. What would happen now? Thinking had made nothing clear. Here was offered what every warm-blooded man whose spring is past desires, youth and beauty, and in that youth a renewal of his own. What all men, save hypocrites and Englishmen, would even admit that they desired. And it was so offered to one who had neither religious nor moral scruples, as they are commonly understood. In theory he could accept. In practice he did not as yet know what he could do. One thing only he had discovered during the night's reflections, that those who scouted belief in the principle of liberty made no greater mistake than to suppose that liberty was dangerous because it made a man a libertine. To those with any decency, the creed of freedom was of all the most enchanting. Easy enough to break chains imposed by others, fling his cap over the windmill, and cry for the moment at least, "I'm unfettered, free." Hard indeed to say the same to his own unfettered self. Yes, his own self was in the judgment seat. By his own verdict and decision he must abide, and though he ached for the sight of her, and his will seemed paralyzed, many times already he had thought, "It won't do, God help me." Then 12 o'clock had come, and she had not. Would the girl on the magpie horse be all he would see of her today? That unsatisfying work, so cold and devoid of witchery? Better have tried to paint her, with a red flower in her hair, a pout in her lips, and her eyes fey or languorous. Goya could have painted her. And then, just as he had given her up, she came. After taking one look at his face, she slipped in ever so quietly, like a very good child. Marvelous the instinct and finesse of the young when they are women. Not a vestige in her of yesterday's seductive power, not a sign that there had been a yesterday at all, just confiding, like a daughter, sitting there telling him about Ireland, showing him the little batch of drawings she had done while she was away. Had she brought them because she knew they would make him feel sorry for her? What could have been less dangerous, more appealing to the protective and paternal side of him, than she was that morning, as if she only wanted what her father and her home could not give her, only wanted to be a sort of daughter to him. She went away demurely as she had come, refusing to stay to lunch, manifestly avoiding Sylvia. Only then he realized that she must have taken alarm from the look of strain on his face, been afraid that he would send her away. Only then perceived that, with her appeal to his protection, she had been binding him closer, making it harder for him to break away and hurt her. And the fevered aching began again, worse than ever, the moment he lost sight of her. And more than ever he felt in the grip of something beyond his power to fight against. Something that, however he swerved and backed and broke away, would close in on him, find means to bind him again, hand and foot. In the afternoon, Dromore's confidential man brought him a note. The fellow, with his cast-down eyes and his well-parted hair, seemed to let in to be saying, "Yes, sir, it is quite natural that you should take the note out of eyeshot, sir, but I know. Fortunately, there is no necessity for alarm. I am strictly confidential." And this was what the note contained. "You promised to ride with me once. You did promise, and you never have. Do please ride with me tomorrow. Then you'll get what you want for the statuette instead of being so cross with it. You can have Dad's horse. He has gone to Newmarket again. And I'm so lonely. Please tomorrow at 2:30, starting from here. Nell." To hesitate in view of those confidential eyes was not possible. It must be yes or no. And if no, it would only mean that she would come in the morning instead. So he said, "Just say all right." "Very good, sir. Then from the door, Mr. Dromore will be away till Saturday, sir." Now why had the fellow said that? Curious how this desperate secret feeling of his own made him see sinister meaning in this servant, in Oliver's visit of last night, in everything. It was vile, this suspiciousness. He could feel, almost see himself deteriorating already, with this furtive feeling in his soul. It would soon be written on his face. But what was the use of troubling? What would come, would, one way or the other. And suddenly he remembered with a shock that it was the 1st of November, Sylvia's birthday. He had never before forgotten it. In the disturbance of that discovery, he was very near to going and pouring out to her the whole story of his feelings. A charming birthday present that would make. Taking his hat instead, he dashed round to the nearest flower shop. A Frenchwoman kept it. What had she? "What did Monsieur desire?" "No, not those. White flowers." Yes, that would do. To be sent at once. At once. Next door was a jeweler's. He had never really known if Sylvia cared for jewels, since one day he happened to remark that they were vulgar, and, feeling that he had fallen low indeed, to be trying to atone with some miserable gewgaw for never having thought of her all day, because he had been thinking of another, he went in and bought the only ornament whose ingredients did not make his gorge rise. 2 small, pear-shaped black pearls, one at each end of a fine platinum chain. Coming out with it, he noticed over the street, in a clear sky fast deepening to indigo, the thinnest slip of a new moon, like a bright swallow with wings bent back, flying towards the ground. That meant fine weather. If it could only be fine weather in his heart, then in order that the azalea might arrive first, he walked up and down the square which he and Oliver had patrolled the night before. When he went in, Sylvia was just placing the white azalea in the window of the drawing-room, and stealing up behind her, he clasped the little necklet around her throat. She turned round and clung to him. He could feel that she was greatly moved, and remorse stirred in him, that he was betraying her with that kiss. But even while he kissed her, he was hardening his heart. End of section 48. Part 3, Section 11 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy, Section 49. Next day, still following the lead of her words about fresh air and his tired look, he told her that he was going to ride, and did not say with whom. After applauding his resolution, she was silent for a little, and then asked, "Why don't you ride with Nell?" He had already so lost his dignity that he hardly felt disgrace in answering, "It might bore her." "Oh no, it won't bore her." Had she meant anything by that? And feeling as if he were fencing with his own soul, he said, "Very well, I will." He had perceived suddenly that he did not know his wife, having always till now believed that it was she who did not quite know him. If she had not been out at lunch-time, he would have launched at himself, afraid of his own face, for feverishness in sick persons mount steadily with the approach of a certain hour, and surely his face, to anyone who could have seen him being conveyed to Piccadilly, would have suggested a fevered invalid rather than a healthy middle-aged sculptor in a cab. The horses were before the door. the little magpie horse, and a thoroughbred bay mare weeded from Drogmore's racing stable. Nell, too, was standing ready, her cheeks very pink and her eyes very bright. She did not wait for him to mount her, but took the aid of the confidential man. What was it that made her look so perfect on that little horse? Shape of limb, or something soft and fiery in her spirit that the little creature knew of? They started in silence, but as soon as the sound of hoofs died on the tail of the rotten row, she turned to him. "It was lovely of you to come. I thought you'd be afraid. You are afraid of me." And Lennon thought, "You're right. But please don't look like yesterday. Today's too heavenly. Oh, I love beautiful days, and I love riding and—" She broke off and looked at him. "Why can't you just be nice to me," she seemed to be saying, "and love me as you ought?" That was her power, the conviction that he did, and ought to love her, that she ought to, and did love him. How simple. But riding, too, is a simple passion, and simple passions distract each other. It was a treat to be on that bay mare, who so to be trusted to ride the best as Johnny Dromore. At the far end of the row she cried out, "Let's go on to Richmond now," and trotted off into the road, as if she knew she could do with him what she wished. And following meekly, he asked himself, why? What was there in her to make up to him for all that he was losing? His power of work, his dignity, his self-respect. What was there? Just those eyes and lips and hair? And as if she knew what he was thinking, she turned around and smiled. So they jogged on over the bridge and across Barnes Common to Richmond Park. But the moment they touched turf, with one look back at him, she was off. Had she all the time meant to give him this breakneck chase, or had the loveliness of that autumn day gone to her head? Blue sky and coppery flames of bracken in the sun, and the beech leaves and the oak leaves, pure highland colouring, come south for once. When in the first burst he had tested the mare's wind, this chase of her indeed was sheer delight. Through glades over fallen tree trunks, and bracken up to the hawks, and across the open, past a herd of amazed and solemn deer, over rotten ground, all rabbit burrows, till just as he thought he was up to her, she slipped away by a quick turn round trees. Mischief incarnate, but something deeper than mischief too. He came up with her at last, and leaned over to seize her rein. With a cut of her whip that missed his hand by a bare inch, and a wrench she made him shoot past, wheeled in her tracks, and was off again like an arrow, back amongst the trees, lying right forward under the boughs along the neck of her little horse. Then out from amongst the trees she shot downhill. Right down she went full tilt, and after her went Lennon, lying back and expecting the bay mare to come down at every stride. This was her idea of fun. She switched round at the bottom and went galloping along the foot of the hill, and he thought, now I've got her. She could not break back up that hill, and there was no other cover for fully half a mile. Then he saw, not 30 yards in front, an old sand pit, and great God, she was going straight at it. And shouting frantically, he reined his mare outwards, but she only raised her whip, cut the magpie horse over the flank, and rode right on. He saw that little demon gather its feet and spring. Down, down, saw him pitch, struggle, sink, and she, flung forward, roll over and lie on her back. He felt nothing at the moment, only had that fixed vision of a yellow patch of sand, the blue sky, a rook flying, and her face upturned. But when he came on her, she was on her feet, holding the bridle of her dazed horse. No sooner did he touch her than she sank down. Her eyes were closed, but he could feel that she had not fainted, and he just held her, and kept pressing his lips to her eyes and forehead. Suddenly she let her head fall back, and her lips met his. Then opening her eyes, she said, "I'm not hurt, only funny. Has Magpie cut his knees?" Not knowing what he did, he got up to look. The little horse was cropping at some grass, unharmed. The sand and fern had saved his knees, and the languid voice behind him said, "It's all right. You can leave the horses. They'll come when they call." Now that he knew she was unhurt, he felt angry. Why had she behaved in this mad way, given him this fearful shock? But in that the same languid voice went on, "Don't be cross with me. I thought at first I'd pull up, but then I thought, if I jump he can't help being nice, so I did." Don't leave off loving me because I'm not hurt, please." Terribly moved, he sat down beside her, took her hands in his, and said, "Well, Nell, it's all wrong. It's madness." "Why? Don't think about it. I don't want you to think, only to love me." "My child, you don't know what love is." For answer, she only flung her arms round his neck. Then, since he held back from kissing her, let them fall again and jumped up. "Very well, but I love you. You can think of that. You can't prevent me." And without waiting for help, she mounted the magpie horse from the sand heap where they had fallen. Very sober that ride home. The horses, as if ashamed of their mad chase, were edging close to each other, so that now and then his arm would touch her shoulder. He asked her once what she had felt while she was jumping. "Only to be sure my foot was free. It was rather horrid coming down, thinking of Magpie's knees." And touching the little horse's goat-like ears, she added softly, "Poor dear, he'll be stiff tomorrow." She was again only confiding, rather drowsy child. Or was it that the fierceness of those past moments had killed his power of feeling? An almost dreamy hour, with the sun going down, the lamps being lighted one by one, and a sort of sweet oblivion over everything. At the door, where the groom was waiting, Lennon would have said goodbye, but she whispered, "Oh no, please, I am tired now. You might help me up a little." And so, half carrying her, he mounted past the Vanity Fair cartoons, and through the corridor with the red paper and the Van Beers drawings, into the room where he had first seen her. One settled back in Dromer's great chair, with the purring kitten curled up on her neck, she murmured, "Isn't it nice? You can make tea, and we'll have hot buttered toast." And so Lennon stayed, while the confidential man brought tea and toast, and never once looking at them, seemed to know all that had passed, all that might be to come. Then they were alone again, and gazing down at her stretched out in that great chair, Lennon thought, "Thank God that I'm too tired, too body and soul." But suddenly she looked up at him, and pointing to the picture that today had no curtains drawn, said, "Do you think I'm like her? I made Oliver tell me about myself this summer. That's why you needn't bother. It doesn't matter what happens to me, you see, and I don't care, because you can love me without feeling bad about it. And you will, won't you?" Then, with her eyes still on his face, she went on quickly, "Only we won't talk about that now, will we? It's too cozy. I am nice and tired. Do smoke." But Lennon's fingers trembled so that he could hardly light that cigarette, and watching them, she said, "Please give me one. Dad doesn't like my smoking." The virtue of Johnny Dromore, yes, it would always be by proxy, and he muttered, "How do you think he would like to know about this afternoon, Nell?" "I don't care." Then peering up through the kitten's fur, she murmured, "Oliver wants me to go to a dance on Saturday. It's for a charity. Shall I?" "Of course. Why not?" "Will you come?" "I? Oh, do. You must. It's my very first, you know. I've got an extra ticket." And against his will, his judgment, everything, Lennon answered, "Yes." She clapped her hands, and the kitten crawled down to her knees. When he got up to go, she did not move, but just looked up at him, and how he got away he did not know. Stopping his cab a little short of home, he ran, for he felt cold and stiff, and letting himself in with his latchkey, went straight to the drawing-room. The door was ajar, and Sylvia standing at the window. He heard her sigh, and his heart smote him. Very still and slender and lonely she looked out there, with the light shining on her fair hair so that it seemed almost white. Then when she turned and saw him, he noticed her throat, working with the effort she made not to show him anything, and he said, "Surely you haven't been anxious?" Nell had quite a bit of a fall, jumping into a sand pit. She's quite mad sometimes. I stayed to tea with her, just to make sure she wasn't really hurt. But as he spoke, he loathed himself. His voice sounded so false. She only answered, "It's all right, dear." But he saw that she kept her eyes, those blue, too true eyes, averted, even when she kissed him. And so began another evening and night and morning of fever, subterfuge, weariness, aching. A round of half-ecstatic torment, out of which he seemed no more able to break than a man can break through the walls of a cell. Though it live but a day in the sun, though it drown in tenebrous night the dark flower of passion will have its hour. End of section 49.
Part 3, Section 12 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. Section 12. To deceive undoubtedly requires a course of training, and unversed in this art, Lenin was fast finding it intolerable to scheme and watch himself, and mislead one who looked up to him ever since they were children. Yet all the time he had a feeling that since he alone knew all the circumstances of his case, he alone was entitled to blame or to excuse himself. The glib judgments that moralists would pass upon his conduct could be nothing but the imbecilities of smug and Pharisaic fools, of those not under this drugging spell, of such as had not blood enough, perhaps, ever to fall beneath it. The day after the ride, Nell had not come, and he had no word from her. Was she, then, hurt after all? She had lain back very inertly in that chair, and Sylvia never asked if he knew how the girl was after her fall, nor offered to send round to inquire. Did she not wish to speak of her, or had she simply not believed? When there was so much he could not talk of, it seemed hard that just what happened to be true should be distrusted. She had not yet, indeed, by a single word, suggested that she felt he was deceiving her. But at heart he knew that she was not deceived. Those feelers of a woman who loves, can anything check their delicate apprehension? Towards evening the longing to see the girl, a sensation as if she were calling him to come to her, became almost insupportable. Yet whatever excuse he gave, he felt that Sylvia would know where he was going. He sat on the one side of the fire, she on the other, and they both read books. The only strange thing about their reading was that neither of them ever turned a leaf. It was Don Quixote he read, the page which had the words, "Let Altisidora weep or sing, still I am Dulcinea's, and hers alone, dead or alive, dutiful and unchanged, in spite of all the necromantic powers in the world." And so the evening passed. When she went up to bed, he was very near to stealing out, driving up to the Dromores' door, and inquiring of the confidential man. But the thought of the confounded fellow's eyes was too much for him, and he held out. He took up Sylvia's book, De Maupassant's For comme l'amour, opened at the page where the poor woman finds that her lover has passed away from her to her own daughter. And as he read, the tears rolled down his cheek. Sylvia, Sylvia! Were not his old favorite words from that old favorite book still true? Dulcinea del Toboso is the most beautiful woman in the world, and I the most unfortunate knight upon the earth. It were unjust that such perfection should suffer through my weakness. No, pierce my body with your lance, knight, and let my life expire with my honor. Why could he not wrench this feeling from his heart, banish this girl from his eyes? Why could he not be wholly true to her, who was and always had been wholly true to him? Horrible, this will-less, nerveless feeling, this paralysis, as if he were a puppet moved by a cruel hand. And as once before, it seemed to him that the girl was sitting there in Sylvia's chair, in her dark red frock, with her eyes fixed on him. Uncannily vivid, that impression. A man could not go on long with his head in chancery like this, without becoming crazed. It was growing dusk on Saturday afternoon when he gave up that intolerable waiting and opened the studio door to go to Nell. It was now just 2 days since he had seen or heard of her. She had spoken of a dance for that very night, of his going to it. She must be ill. But he had not taken 6 steps before he saw her coming. She had on a gray furry scarf, hiding her mouth, making her look much older. The moment the door was shut, she threw it off, went to the hearth, drew up a little stool, and holding her hands out to the fire, said, "Have you thought about me? Have you thought enough now?" And he answered, "Yes, I've thought, but I'm no nearer." "Why? Nobody ever need know you love me, and if they did, I wouldn't care." Simple! How simple! Glorious, egoistic youth! He could not speak of Sylvia to this child, speak of his married life, hitherto so dignified, so almost sacred it was impossible. Then he heard her say, "It can't be wrong to love you. I don't care if it's wrong," and saw her lips quivering and her eyes suddenly piteous and scared, as if for the first time she doubted of the issue. Here was fresh torment to watch an unhappy child. And what was the use of even trying to make clear to her, on the very threshold of life, the hopeless maze that he was wandering in? What chance of making her understand the marsh of mud and tangled weeds he must drag through to reach her? Nobody need know. So simple. What if his heart and his wife's heart? And pointing to his new work, the first man bewitched by the first nymph, he said, "Look at this, Nell. That nymph is you, and this man is me." She got up and came to look, and while she was gazing, he greedily drank her in. What a strange mixture of innocence and sorcery! What a wonderful young creature to bring to full knowledge of love within his arms! And he said, "You had better understand what you are to me, all that I shall never know again." There it is in that nymph's face. Oh, no, not your face. And there am I, struggling through slime to reach you. Not my face, of course. She said, "Poor face," then covered her own. Was she going to cry and torture him still more? But instead she only murmured, "But you have reached me," swayed towards him and put her lips to his. He gave way then. From that too stormy kiss of his she drew back for a second, then, as if afraid of her own recoil, snuggled close again. But the instinctive shrinking of innocence had been enough for Lennon. He dropped his arms and said, "You must go, child." Without a word, she picked up her fur, put it on, and stood waiting for him to speak. Then, as he did not, she held out something white. It was the card for the dance. "You said you were coming," and he nodded. Her eyes and lips smiled at him. She opened the door, and still with that slow, happy smile, went out. Yes, he would be coming, wherever she was, whenever she wanted him. His blood on fire, heedless of everything but to rush after happiness. Lennon spent those hours before the dance. He had told Sylvia that he would be dining at his club, a set of rooms owned by a small coterie of artists in Chelsea. He had taken this precaution, feeling that he could not sit through dinner opposite her and then go out to that dance. And Nell. He had spoken of a guest at the club to account for evening dress. Another lie. But what did it matter? He was lying all the time. If not in words, in action. Must lie, indeed, to save her suffering. He stopped at the French woman's flower shop. Que désirez-vous, monsieur? Des gilets rouges? J'en ai John besoin soir. Des gilets rouges? Yes, those tonight. To this address. No green with them, no card. How strange the feeling with the die once cast for love, of rushing, of watching his own self being left behind. In the Brompton Road, outside a little restaurant, a thin musician was playing on a violin. Ah, and he knew this place. He would go in there, not to the club, and the fiddler should have all he had to spare for playing those tunes of love. He turned in. He had not been there since the day before that night on the river, 20 years ago. Never since, and yet it was not changed. The same tarnished gilt and smell of cooking, the same macaroni and the same tomato sauce, the same Chianti flasks, the same staring, light blue walls wreathed with pink flowers. Only the waiter different, hollow-cheeked, patient, dark of eye. He, too, should be well tipped. And that poor, over-hatted lady, eating her frugal meal, to her at all events a look of kindness. For all desperate creatures he must feel this desperate night, and suddenly he thought of Oliver. Another desperate one. What should he say to Oliver at this dance? He, aged 47, coming there without his wife. Some imbecility, such as watching the human form divine in motion, catching sidelights on Nell for the statuette. Some can't. It did not matter. The wine was drawn, and he must drink. It was still early when he left the restaurant. A dry night, very calm, not cold. When had he danced last with Olive Cremier? Before he knew he loved her. Well, that memory could not be broken, for he would not dance tonight. Just watch, sit with the girl a few minutes, feel her hand cling to his, see her eyes turned back to him, and come away. And then the future. For the wine was drawn. The leaf of a plane tree, fluttering down, caught on his sleeve. Autumn would soon be gone, and after autumn, only winter. She would have done with him long before he came to winter. Nature would see to it that youth called for her and carried her away. Nature in her courses. But just to cheat nature for a little while, to cheat nature, what greater happiness! Here was the place, with red-striped awning, carriages driving away, loiterers watching. He turned in with a beating heart. Was he before her? How would she come to this first dance? With Oliver alone? Or had some chaperone been found? To have come because she, this child so lovely, born outside, might have need of chaperonage, would have been some comfort to dignity, so wistful, so lost as his. But alas, he knew he was only there because he could not keep away. Already they were dancing in the hall upstairs, but not she yet, and he stood leaning against the wall where she must pass. Lonely and out of place he felt, as if everyone must know why he was there. People stared, and he heard a girl ask, "Who's that against the wall with the hair and dark mustache?" And her partner murmuring his answer, and her voice again, "Yes, he looks as if he were seeing sand and lions." For whom, then, did they take him? Thank heaven! They were all the usual sort. There would be no one that he knew. Suppose Johnny Drumore himself came with Nell. He was to be back on Saturday. What could he say then? How meet those doubting, knowing eyes, goggling with the fixed philosophy that a man has but one use for woman? God! And it would be true. For a moment he was on the point of getting his coat and hat and sneaking away. That would mean not seeing her till Monday, and he stood his ground. But after tonight there must be no more such risks. Their meetings must be wisely planned, must sink underground. And then he saw her at the foot of the stairs, in a dress of a shell-pink color, with one of his flowers in her light brown hair, and the others tied to the handle of a tiny fan. How self-possessed she looked, as if this were indeed her native element. Her neck and arms bare, her cheeks a deep, soft pink, her eyes quickly turning here and there. She began mounting the stairs and saw him. Was ever anything so lovely as she looked just then? Behind her he marked Oliver, and a tall girl with red hair, and another young man. He moved deliberately to the top of the stairs on the wall side, so that from behind they could not see her face when she greeted him. She put the little fan with the flowers to her lips, and holding out her hand, said quick and low, "The 4th, it's a polka. We'll sit out, won't we?" Then swaying a little, so that her hair and the flower in it almost touched her face, she passed, and there in her stead stood Oliver. Lenin had expected one of his old insolent looks, but the young man's face was eager and quite friendly. "It was awfully good of you to come, Mr. Lenin. Is Mrs. Lenin?" And Lenin murmured, "She wasn't able. She's not quite," and could have sunk into the shining floor. Youth with its touching confidence, its eager trust. This was the way he was fulfilling his duty towards youth. When they had passed into the ballroom, he went back to his position against the wall. They were dancing number 3. His time of waiting, then, was drawing to a close. From where he stood, he could not see the dancers. No use to watch her go round in someone else's arms. Not a true waltz, some French or Spanish pavement song played in waltz time. Bizarre, pathetic, whirling after its own happiness. That chase for happiness. Well, life with all its prizes and its possibilities had nothing that quite satisfied, save just the fleeting moments of passion. Nothing else quite poignant enough to be called pure joy, or so it seemed to him. The waltz was over. He could see her now, on a rout seat against the wall, with the other young man, turning her eyes constantly, as if to make sure that he was still standing there. What subtle fuel was always being added to the fire by that flattery of her inexplicable adoration, of those eyes that dragged him to her, yet humbly followed him, too. 5 times, while she sat there, he saw the red-haired girl or Oliver bring men up, saw youths cast longing glances, saw girls watching her with cold appraisement, or with a touching frank delight. From the moment that she came in, there had been, in her father's phrase, only one in it. And she could pass all this by and still want him. Incredible. At the first notes of the polka, he went to her. It was she who found their place of refuge, a little alcove behind 2 palm plants. But sitting there, he realized as never before that there was no spiritual communion between him and this child. She could tell him her troubles or her joys. He could soothe or sympathize, but never would the gap between their natures and their ages be crossed. His happiness was only in the sight and touch of her. But that, God knew, was happiness enough, a feverish, craving joy, like an overtired man's thirst, growing with the drink on which it tries to slake itself. Sitting there in the scent of those flowers, and of some sweet essence in her hair, with her fingers touching his, and her eyes seeking his. He tried loyally not to think of himself, to grasp her sensations at this her first dance, and just help her to enjoyment. But he could not. Paralyzed, made drunk by that insensate longing to take her in his arms and crush her to him, as he had those few hours back. He could see her expanding like a flower in all this light and motion and intoxicating admiration round her. What business had he in her life? With this dark hunger after secret hours, he a coin worn thin already, a destroyer of the freshness and the glamour of her youth and beauty. Then, holding up the flowers, she said, "Did you give me these because of the one I gave you?" "Yes." "What did you do with that?" "Burned it." "Oh, but why?" "Because you're a witch, and witches must be burned with all their flowers." "Are you going to burn me?" He put his hand on her cool arm. "Feel. The flames are lighted." "You may. I don't care." She took his hand and laid her cheek against it. Yet to the music, which had begun again, the tip of her shoe was already beating time. And he said, "You ought to be dancing, child." "Oh, no. Only it's a pity you don't want to." "Yes. Do you understand that it must all be secret, underground?" She covered his lips with the fan and said, "You're not to think. You're not to think. Never." "When can I come?" "I must find the best way. Not tomorrow. Nobody must know, Nell, for your sake. For hers, nobody." She nodded and repeated with a soft, mysterious wisdom, "Nobody." And then aloud, "Here's Oliver. It was awfully good of you to come. Good night." And as on Oliver's arm she left their little refuge, she looked back. He lingered to watch her through this one dance. How they made all the other couples sink into insignificance, with that something in them both that was better than mere good looks. That something, not outre or eccentric, but poignant, wayward. They went well together, those two Dromores, his dark head and her fair head, his clear, brown, daring eyes, and her gray, languorous, mesmeric eyes. Ah, Master Oliver was happy now, with her so close to him. It was not jealousy that Lennon felt, not quite. One did not feel jealous of the young. Something very deep, pride, sense of proportion, who knew what, prevented that. She, too, looked happy, as if her soul were dancing, vibrating with the music and the scent of the flowers. He waited for her to come round once more, to get for a last time that flying glance turned back, then found his coat and hat, and went. End of section 50. Recording by John Brandon. Part 13, Section 51 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by John Brandon. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. Section 51. Outside, he walked a few steps, then stood looking back at the windows of the hall, through some trees, the shadows of whose trunks, in the light of a street lamp, were spilled out along the ground like the splines of a fan. A church clock struck 11. For hours yet she would be there, going round and round in the arms of youth. Try as he might, he could never recapture for himself the look that Oliver's face had worn, the look that was the symbol of so much more than he himself could give her. Why had she come into his life? To her undoing and his own? And the bizarre thought came to him, if she were dead, should I really care? Should I not be almost glad? If she were dead, her witchery would be dead, and I could stand up straight again and look people in the face. What was this power that played with men, darted into them, twisted their hearts to rags? This power that had looked through her eyes when she put her fan, with his flowers, to her lips. The thrumming of the music ceased. He walked away. It must have been nearly 12 when he reached home. Now once more would begin the gruesome process of deception, flinching of soul, and brazening of visage. It would be better when the whole thievish business was irretrievably begun and ordered in its secret courses. There was no light in the drawing-room, save just the glow of the fire. If only Sylvia might have gone to bed. Then he saw her sitting motionless out there by the uncurtained window. He went over to her and began his hateful formula. "I'm afraid you've been lonely. I had to stay rather late. A dull evening." And since she did not move or answer, but just sat there, very still and white, he forced himself to go close, bend down to her, touch her cheek, even to kneel beside her. She looked round then. Her face was quiet enough, but her eyes were strangely eager. With a pitiful little smile, she broke out, "Oh, Mark, what is it? What is it? Anything is better than this." Perhaps it was the smile, perhaps her voice or eyes, but something gave way in Lennon. Secrecy, precaution went by the board. Bowing his head against her breast, he poured it all out, while they clung, clutched together in the half-dark, like two frightened children. Only when he had finished did he realize that if she had pushed him away, refused to let him touch her, it would have been far less piteous, far easier to bear, than her wan face and her hands clutching him, and her words, "I never thought. You and I. Oh, Mark, you and I." The trust in their life together, in himself, that those words revealed, yet not greater than he had, still had. He could not understand. He had known that she could never understand. It was why he fought so for secrecy all through. She was taking it as if she had lost everything, and in his mind she had lost nothing. This passion, this craving for youth and life, this madness, call it what one would, was something quite apart, not touching his love and need of her. If she would only believe that. Over and over he repeated it, over and over again, perceived that she could not take it in. The only thing she saw was that his love had gone from her to another, though that was not true. Suddenly she broke out of his arms, pushing him from her, and cried, "That girl, hateful, horrible, false." Never had he seen her look like this, with flaming spots in her white cheeks, soft lips and chin distorted, blue eyes flaming, breast heaving, as if each breath were drawn from lungs that received no air. And then as quickly the fire went out of her. She sank down on the sofa, covering her face with her arms, rocking to and fro. She did not cry, but a little moan came from her now and then. And each one of those sounds was to Lennon like the cry of something he was murdering. At last he went and sat down on the sofa by her, and said, "Sylvia, Sylvia, don't, oh, don't." And she was silent, ceasing to rock herself, letting him smooth and stroke her. But her face she kept hidden, and only once she spoke, so low that he could hardly hear. "I can't. I won't keep you from her." And with the awful feeling that no words could reach or soothe the wound in that tender heart, he could only go on stroking and kissing her hands. It was atrocious, horrible, this that he had done. God knew that he had not sought it. The thing had come to him. Surely, even in her misery, she could see that. Deep down beneath his grief and self-hatred, he knew what neither she nor anyone else could know, that he could not have prevented this feeling, which went back to days before he ever saw the girl, that no man could have stopped that feeling in himself. This craving and roving was as much part of him as his eyes and hands, as overwhelming and natural a longing as his hunger for work, or his need of the peace that Sylvia gave, and alone could give him. That was the tragedy. It was all sunk and rooted in the very nature of a man. Since the girl had come into their lives, he was no more unfaithful to his wife in thought than he had been before. If only she could look into him, see him exactly as he was, as without part or lot in the process he had been made, then she would understand and even might not suffer. But she could not, and he could never make it plain, and solemnly, desperately, with a weary feeling of the futility of words, he went on trying. Could she not see? It was all a thing outside him, a craving, a chase after beauty and life, after his own youth. At that word, she looked at him. "And do you think I don't want my youth back?" He stopped. For a woman to feel that her beauty, the brightness of her hair and eyes, the grace and suppleness of her limbs, were slipping from her, and from the man she loved. Was there anything more bitter, or any more sacred duty, than not to add to that bitterness, not to push her with suffering into old age, but to help keep the star of her faith in her charm intact? Man and woman, they both wanted youth again. She that she might give it all to him, he because it would help him towards something new. Just that world of difference. He got up and said, "Come, dear, let's try and sleep." He had not once said that he could give it up. The words would not pass his lips, though he knew she must be conscious that he had not said them, must be longing to hear them. All he had been able to say was, "So long as you want me, you shall never lose me, and I will never keep anything from you again." Up in their room she lay hour after hour in his arms, quite unresentful but without life in her, and with eyes that when his lips touched them were always wet. What a maze was a man's heart, wherein he must lose himself every minute. What involved and intricate turnings and turnings on itself. What fugitive replacement of emotion by emotion. What strife between pities and passions. What longing for peace. And in his feverish exhaustion, which was almost sleep, Lennon hardly knew whether it was the thrum of music or Sylvia's moaning that he heard, her body or Nell's within his arms. But life had to be lived, a face preserved against the world, engagements kept. And the nightmare went on for both of them, under the calm surface of an ordinary Sunday. They were like people walking at the edge of a high cliff, not knowing from step to step whether they would fall, or like swimmers struggling for issue out of a dark whirlpool. In the afternoon they went together to a concert. It was just something to do, something that saved them for an hour or two from the possibility of speaking on the one subject left to them. The ship had gone down, and they were clutching at anything that for a moment would help to keep them above water. In the evening some people came to supper, a writer and 2 painters with their wives. A grim evening, never more so than when the conversation turned on that perennial theme, the freedom, spiritual, mental, physical requisite for those who practice art. All the stale arguments were brought forth, and had to be joined in with unmoved faces. And for all their talk of freedom, Lenin could see the volte-face his friends would be making, if they only knew. It was not the thing to seduce young girls, as if, forsooth, there were freedom in doing only what people thought the thing. Their cant about the free artist spirit experiencing everything would wither the moment it came up against a canon of good form, so that in truth it was no freer than the bourgeois spirit with its conventions, or the priest spirit with its cry of sin. No, no. To resist, if resistance were possible, to this dragging power, maxims of good form, dogmas of religion and morality, were no help. Nothing was any help, but some feeling stronger than passion itself. Sylvia's face, forced to smile. That indeed was a reason why they should condemn him. None of their doctrines about freedom could explain that away. The harm, the death that came to a man's soul when he made a loving, faithful creature suffer. But they were gone at last, with their thanks so much, and their delightful evening, and those 2 were face to face for another night. He knew that it must begin all over again, inevitable, after the stab of that wretched argument plunged into their hearts, and turned all the evening. I mustn't keep you starved and spoil your work. Don't think of it, Mark. I can bear it. And then a breakdown worse than the night before. What genius, what sheer genius nature had for torturing her creatures. If anyone had told him, even so little as a week ago, that he could have caused such suffering to Sylvia, whom as a child, with wide blue eyes and a blue bow on her flaxen head, he had guarded across fields full of imaginary bulls, Sylvia, in whose hair his star had caught, Sylvia, who night and day for 15 years had been his devoted wife, whom he loved and still admired, he would have given him the lie direct. It would have seemed incredible, monstrous, silly. Had all married men and women such things to go through? Was this but a very usual crossing of the desert? Or was it once for all shipwreck? Death, unholy, violent death, in a storm of sand. Another night of misery, and no answer to that question yet. He had told her that he would not see Nell again without first letting her know. So when morning came, he simply wrote the words, "Don't come today," showed them to Sylvia, and sent them by a servant to Dromores. Hard to describe the bitterness with which he entered his studio this morning. In all this chaos, what of his work? Could he ever have peace of mind for it again? Those people last night had talked of inspiration, of passion, of experience. In pleading with her, he had used the words himself. She, poor soul, had but repeated them, trying to endure them, to believe them true. And were they true? Again, no answer, or certainly none that he could give. To have had the waters broken up, to be plunged into emotion, to feel desperately instead of stagnating. Some day he might be grateful, who knew? Some day there might be fair country again, beyond this desert, where he could work even better than before. But just now, as well expect creative work from a condemned man. It seemed to him that he was equally destroyed, whether he gave Nell up, and with her, once for all, that roving, seeking instinct which ought forsooth to have been satisfied, and was not, or whether he took Nell, knowing that in doing so he was torturing a woman dear to him. That was as far as he could see today. What he would come to see in time, God only knew. But freedom of the spirit, that was a phrase of bitter irony indeed. And there, with his work all round him, like a man tied hand and foot, he was swept by such a feeling of exasperated rage as he had never known. Women, these women. Only let him be free of both, of all women, and the passions and pities they aroused, so that his brain and his hands might live and work again. They should not strangle, they should not destroy him. Unfortunately, even in his rage, he knew that flight from them both could never help him, one way or the other. The thing would have to be fought through. If it had been a straight fight, even, a clear issue between passion and pity. But both he loved and both he pitied. There was nothing straight and clear about it anywhere. It was all too deeply rooted in full human nature, and the appalling sense of rushing ceaselessly from barrier to barrier began really to affect his brain. True, he had now and then a lucid interval of a few minutes, when the ingenious nature of his own torments struck him as supremely interesting and queer. But this was not precisely a relief, for it only meant, as in prolonged toothache, that his power of feeling had for a moment ceased. A very pretty little hell indeed. All day he had the premonition, amounting to certainty, that Nell would take alarm at those 3 words he had sent her, and come in spite of them. And yet what else could he have written? Nothing save what must have alarmed her more, or plunged him deeper. He had the feeling that she could follow his moods, that her eyes could see him everywhere, as a cat's eyes can see in darkness. That feeling had been with him, more or less, ever since the last evening in October, the evening she came back from her summer, grown up. How long ago? Only 6 days. Was it possible? Ah, yes, she knew when her spell was weakening, when the current wanted, as it were, renewing. At about 6 o'clock, dusk already, without the least surprise, with only a sort of empty quivering, he heard her knock. And just behind the closed door, as near as he could get to her, he stood holding his breath. He had given his word to Sylvia, of his own accord had given it. Through the thin wood of the old door he could hear the faint shuffle of her feet on the pavement, moved a few inches this way and that, as though supplicating the inexorable silence. He seemed to see her head bent a little forward, listening. 3 times she knocked, and each time Lenin writhed. It was so cruel. With that seeing sense of hers, she must know he was there. His very silence would be telling her, for his silence had its voice, its pitiful, breathless sound. Then, quite distinctly, he heard her sigh, and her footsteps move away, and covering his face with his hands, he rushed to and fro in the studio, like a madman. No sound of her any more. Gone. It was unbearable. And seizing his hat, he ran out. Which way? At random, he ran towards the square. There she was, over by the railings, languidly, irresolutely moving towards home. End of section 51. Recording by John Brandon.
Part 3, Section 14 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. Part 3, Section 14. But now that she was within reach, he wavered. He had given his word. Was he going to break it? Then she turned and saw him, and he could not go back. In the biting easterly wind her face looked small and pinched and cold, but her eyes only the larger, the more full of witchery, as if beseeching him not to be angry, not to send her away. "I had to come. I got frightened. Why did you write such a tiny little note?" He tried to make his voice sound quiet and ordinary. "You must be brave now. I have had to tell her." She clutched at his arm, then drew herself up and said in her clear, clipped voice, "Oh, I suppose she hates me, then. She is terribly unhappy." They walked a minute. That might have been an hour without a word. Not round the square as he had walked with Oliver, but away from the house. At last she said in a half-choked voice, "I only want a little bit of you." And he answered dully, "In love there are no little bits, no standing still." Then suddenly he felt her hand in his, the fingers lacing, twining restlessly amongst his own. And again the half-choked voice said, "But you will let me see you sometimes. You must." Hardest of all to stand against was this pathetic, clinging, frightened child, and not knowing very clearly what he said. He murmured, "Yes, yes, it'll be all right. Be brave. You must be brave now. It'll all come right." But she only answered, "No, no, I'm not brave. I shall do something." Her face looked just as when she had written at that gravel pit. Lovely, wild, undisciplined, without resource of any kind. What might she not do? Why could he not stir without bringing disaster upon one or other? And between these two, suffering so because of him, he felt as if he had lost his own existence. In quest of happiness, he had come to that. Suddenly she said, "Oliver asked me again at the dance on Saturday. He said you had told him to be patient. Did you?" "Yes." "Why?" "I was sorry for him." She let his hand go. "Perhaps you'd like me to marry him." Very clearly he saw those two going round and round over the shining floor. "Would be better now." She made a little sound of anger or dismay. "You don't really want me, then?" That was his chance. But with her arm touching his, her face so pale and desperate, and those maddening eyes turned to him, he could not tell that lie, and answered, "Yes, I want you, God knows." At that a sigh of content escaped her, as if she were saying to herself, "If he wants me, he will not let me go." Strange little tribute to her faith and love and her own youth. They had come somehow to Pall Mall by now, and scared to find himself so deep in the hunting ground of the Dromores, Lenin turned hastily towards St. James's Park, that they might cross it in the dark, round to Piccadilly. To be thus slinking out of the world's sight with the daughter of his old roommate, of all men in the world, the last perhaps that he should do this to. A nice treacherous business. But the thing men call honor, what was it when her eyes were looking at him and her shoulder touching his? Since he had spoken those words, "Yes, I want you," she had been silent, fearful perhaps to let other words destroy their comfort. But near the gate by Hyde Park Corner, she put her hand again into his, and again her voice so clear said, "I don't want to hurt anybody, but you will let me come sometime. You will let me see you. You won't leave me all alone, thinking that I'll never see you again." And once more, without knowing what he answered, Lennon murmured, "No, no, it'll be all right, dear. It'll all come right. It must and shall." Again her fingers twined against his, like a child's. She seemed to have a wonderful knowledge of the exact thing to say and do to keep him helpless. And she went on, "I didn't try to love you. It isn't wrong to love. It wouldn't hurt her. I only want a little of your love. A little, always a little." But he was solely bent on comforting her now. To think of her going home and sitting lonely, frightened, and unhappy all the evening was dreadful. And holding her fingers tight, he kept on murmuring words of would-be comfort. Then he saw that they were out in Piccadilly. How far dared he go with her along the railings before he said good-bye? A man was coming toward them, just where he had met Dromore that first fatal afternoon 9 months ago, a man with a slight lurch in his walk, and a tall shining hat a little on one side. But thank heaven it was not Dromore, only one somewhat like him, who in passing stared sphinx-like at Nell. And Lennon said, "You must go home now, child. We mustn't be seen together." For a moment he thought she was going to break down, refuse to leave him. Then she threw up her head, and for a second stood like that, quite motionless, looking in his face. Suddenly, stripping off her glove, she thrust her warm, clinging hand into his. Her lips smiled faintly, tears stood in her eyes. Then she drew her hand away and plunged into the traffic. He saw her turn the corner of her street and disappear, and with the warmth of that passionate little hand still stinging his palm, he almost ran toward Hyde Park. Taking no heed of direction, he launched himself into its dark space, deserted in this cold, homeless wind that had little sound and no scent, traveling its remorseless road under the gray-black sky. The dark firmament and keen, cold air suited one who had little need of aids to emotion, one who had, indeed, but the single wish to get rid, if he only could, of the terrible sensation in his head, that bruised, battered, imprisoned feeling of a man who paces his cell, never, never to get out at either end. Without thought or intention he drove his legs along, not running, because he knew that he would have to stop the sooner. Alas, what more comic spectacle for the eyes of a good citizen than this married man of middle age striding for hours over those dry, dark, empty pastures, hunted by passion and by pity, so that he knew not even whether he had dined. But no good citizen was abroad on an autumn night in a bitter easterly wind. The trees were the sole witnesses of this grim exercise. The trees, resigning to the cold blast their crinkled leaves that fluttered past him, just a little lighter than the darkness. Here and there his feet rustled in the drifts, waiting their turn to serve the little bonfires, whose scent still clung in the air. A desperate walk in this heart of London, round and round, up and down, hour after hour, keeping always in the dark. Not a star in the sky, not a human being spoken to, or even clearly seen, not a bird or beast, just the gleam of the lights far away, and the hoarse muttering of the traffic. A walk as lonely as the voyage of the human soul is lonely from birth to death, with nothing to guide it but the flickering glow from its own frail spirit, lighted it knows not where. And so tired that he could hardly move his legs, but free at last of that awful feeling in his head, free for the first time for days and days, Lennon came out of the park at the gate where he had gone in, and walked towards his home, certain that tonight, one way or the other, it would be decided. End of section 52. Part 3, Section 15 of The Dark Flower. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy. Chapter 15. This long trouble of body and of spirit, was what he remembered, sitting in the armchair beyond his bedroom fire, watching the glow, and Sylvia sleeping there exhausted, while the dark plane-tree leaves tapped at the window in the autumn wind, watching with the uncanny certainty that he would not pass the limits of this night without having made at last a decision that would not alter. For even conflict wears itself out, even indecision has this measure set to its miserable powers of torture, that any issue in the end is better than the hell of indecision itself. Once or twice in those last days even death had seemed to him quite tolerable, but now that his head was clear and he had come to grips, death passed out of his mind like the shadow that it was. Nothing so simple, extravagant, and vain could serve him. Other issues had reality, death none. To leave Sylvia and take this young love away, there was reality in that, but it had always faded as soon as it shaped itself, and now once more it faded. To put such a public and terrible affront on a tender wife whom he loved, do her to death, as it were, before the world's eyes, and then, ever remorseful, grow old while the girl was still young. He could not. If Sylvia had not loved him, yes, or even if he had not loved her, or if again, though loving him, she had stood upon her rights, in any of those events he might have done it. But to leave her whom he did love, and who had said to him so generously, "I will not hamper you, go to her," would be a black atrocity. Every memory, from their boy and girl lovering to the desperate clinging of her arms these last 2 nights, memory with its innumerable tentacles, the invincible strength of its countless threads, bound him to her fast. What then? Must it come, after all, to give up the girl? And sitting there by that warm fire, he shivered. How desolate, sacrilegious, wasteful to throw love away, to turn from the most precious of all gifts, to drop and break that vase. There was not too much love in the world, nor too much warmth and beauty, not, anyway, for those whose sands were running out, whose blood would soon be cold. Could Sylvia not let him keep both her love and the girl's? Could she not bear that? She had said she could. But her face, her eyes, her voice gave her the lie, so that every time he heard her his heart turned sick with pity. This, then, was the real issue. Could he accept from her such a sacrifice, exact a daily misery, see her droop and fade beneath it? Could he bear his own happiness at such a cost? Would it be happiness at all? He got up from the chair and crept toward her. She looked very fragile sleeping there. The darkness below her closed eyelids showed cruelly on that too fair skin, and in her flax-colored hair he saw what he had never noticed, a few strands of white. Her softly opened lips, almost colorless, quivered with her uneven breathing, and now and again a little feverish shiver passed up as from her heart, all soft and fragile. Not much life, not much strength, youth and beauty slipping. To know that he who should be her champion against age and time would day by day be placing one more mark upon her face, one more sorrow in her heart. That he should do this, they both going down the years together. As he stood there holding his breath, bending to look at her, that slurring swish of the plane-tree branch, flung against and against the window by the autumn wind, seemed filling the whole world. Then her lips moved in one of those little soft, hurrying whispers that unhappy dreamers utter, the words all blurred with their wistful rushing. And he thought, I who believe in bravery and kindness, I who hate cruelty, if I do this cruel thing, what shall I have to live for? How shall I work? How bear myself? If I do it, I am lost, an outcast from my own faith, a renegade from all that I believe in. In kneeling there close to that face so sad and lonely, that heart so beaten even in its sleep, he knew that he could not do it, knew it with sudden certainty and a curious sense of peace. Over, the long struggle, over at last. Youth with youth, summer to summer, falling leaf with falling leaf. And behind him the fire flickered and the plane-tree leaves tapped. He rose and crept away stealthily downstairs into the drawing-room, and through the window at the far end out into the courtyard, where he had sat that day by the hydrangea, listening to the piano organ. Very dark and cold and eerie it was there, and he hurried across to his studio. There, too, it was cold and dark and eerie, with its ghostly plaster presences, stale scent of cigarettes, and just one glowing ember of the fire he had left when he rushed out after Nell, those 7 hours ago. He went first to the bureau, turned up its lamp, and taking out some sheets of paper, marked on them directions for his various works. For the statuette of Nell, he noted that it should be taken with his compliments to Mr. Dromore. He wrote a letter to his banker, directing money to be sent to Rome, and to his solicitor, telling him to let the house. He wrote quickly. If Sylvia woke and found him still away, what might she not think? He took a last sheet. Did it matter what he wrote, what deliberate lie, if it helped Nell over the first shock? Dear Nell, I write this hastily in the early hours, to say that we are called out to Italy to my only sister, who is very ill. We leave by the first morning boat, and may be away some time. I will write again. Don't fret, and God bless. M.L. He could not see very well as he wrote. Poor, loving, desperate child. Well, she had youth and strength, and would soon have Oliver, and he took yet another sheet. Dear Oliver, my wife and I are obliged to go post-haste to Italy. I watched you both at the dance the other night. Be very gentle with Nell, and good luck to you. And don't say again that I told you to be patient. It is hardly the way to make her love you. M. Lennon. That then was all. Yes, all. He turned out the little lamp and groped towards the hearth. But one thing left, to say good-bye, to her and youth and passion, to the only salve for the aching that spring and beauty bring, the aching for the wild, the passionate, the new, that never quite dies in a man's heart. Ah, well, sooner or later, all men had to say good-bye to that. All men. All men. He crouched down before the hearth. There was no warmth in that fast-blackening ember, but it still glowed like a dark red flower, and while it lived he crouched there, as though it were that to which he was saying good-bye. And on the door he heard the girl's ghostly knocking, and beside him, a ghost among the ghostly presences, she stood. Slowly the glow blackened, till the last spark had faded out. Then, by the glimmer of the night, he found his way back, softly as he had come, to his bedroom. Sylvia was still sleeping, and to watch for her to wake, he sat down again by the fire, in silence, only stirred by the frail tapping of the autumn leaves, and the little catch in her breathing now and then. It was less troubled than when he had bent over her before, as though in her sleep she knew. He must not miss the moment of her waking, must be beside her before she came to full consciousness, to say, "There, it's all over, we are going away at once. To be ready to offer that quick solace, before she had time to plunge back into her sorrow, was an island in this black sea of night, a single little refuge point for his bereaved and naked being. Something to do, something fixed, real, certain, and yet another long hour before her waking. He sat forward in the chair, with that wistful eagerness, his eyes fixed on her face, staring through it at some vision, some faint glimmering light, far out there beyond, as a traveler watches a star. The end. End of section 53. End of The Dark Flower by John Galsworthy.